Think your job is tough? Try making bread when an underweight loaf could literally cost you an ear. Most of us picture medieval life with a certain romantic haze, don't we? Knights in shining armor, grand feasts, bustling markets. And somewhere in that picture, there's often a rosy-cheeked baker pulling golden loaves from a warm oven, a pleasant smell filling the air. Subscribe and comment for more medieval videos. Forget that picture. Scrub it from your mind. Because the truth about being a medieval baker wasn't some idyllic, flour-dusted dream. It was a brutal, back-breaking, lung-destroying gamble where your livelihood, your health, and even your body parts hung by the thin thread of a precisely weighed loaf. We're going to peel back the layers of flour and sweat to reveal just how terrifyingly precise and how utterly unforgiving the medieval world was for the people who baked the very foundation of everyone's diet. Get ready, because the smell of fresh bread takes on a whole new meaning when the stakes are so incredibly high. These weren't just everyday tradesmen, they were the backbone of society. For most people in medieval Europe, bread wasn't just a side dish or a treat, it was the main event. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It fueled laborers, sustained families, and kept entire towns from starving. Without bread, there was no life. And that put the medieval baker in a truly unique and utterly terrifying position. They were indispensable, yes, but also constantly under the heaviest magnifying glass imaginable. Their profession wasn't just characterized by grueling labor, though there was plenty of that. It was defined by strict regulation and some of the most brutal consequences for even the smallest mistake you could possibly imagine. Let's start with the daily grind, because grind is an understatement. A medieval baker's day started not with the sun, but long before it, often in the dead of night. Picture this. It's still dark, cold, maybe even frosty, and while the rest of the town sleeps soundly, the baker is already wrestling with massive sacks of grain and the unforgiving maw of their oven. Their workplace wasn't some spacious, ventilated kitchen. It was usually a cramped, smoky, sweltering space, dominated by a huge, often clay or stone, oven. This wasn't a modern oven you just set a temperature on. This beast had to be meticulously managed, fed with wood, and stoked to just the right, roaring heat for hours before the first dough even thought about touching its surface. Chopping wood, hauling it, feeding the intense fires, all while the heat built to an unbearable crescendo. That was just the warm-up act. Then came the dough. Forget stand mixers, forget gentle kneading. This was heavy, coarse flour, mixed with water, and often a sourdough starter passed down through generations. Imagine huge wooden troughs filled with what felt like lead. The baker, usually a man, but sometimes a woman, would plunge their arms into that thick, sticky mass, kneading it by hand for what felt like an eternity. Hour after hour, they would push, pull, fold, and stretch, building the gluten, their muscles screaming, their backs aching, sweat pouring down their faces. It was a full-body workout that never ended. And when you did this, day in and day out, for years, it took a massive toll. Chronic back pain wasn't an occupational hazard, it was practically a job requirement. Burns were common. Scorched forearms, singed eyebrows, blistering hands were just part of the uniform. Many bakers carried the scars of their trade for life, a grim reminder of the inferno they worked within. But the heat and the backaches were just the visible wounds. There was a silent killer lurking in every medieval bakery, the flour dust. Imagine an air so thick with fine particles of flour that it shimmered in the rare shafts of light. Every breath a baker took was a mouthful of that dust. Over time, that constant inhalation led to a horrifying condition known as baker's lung or occupational asthma. It was a slow, suffocating disease that gradually robbed them of their breath, making every gasp for air a struggle. It narrowed their airways, inflamed their lungs, and turned a simple cough into a hacking, rattling misery. So, while they were feeding the town, they were slowly, agonizingly killing themselves with every breath. It was a cruel irony, wasn't it, to provide sustenance for so many, while your own body slowly gave out from the very act of doing so. Now, you'd think that given such a vital, back-breaking, and life-shortening profession, bakers would be wealthy, respected figures, right? Not so fast. Here's another bitter truth. Despite producing hundreds, sometimes thousands, of loaves daily, many bakers themselves rarely ate well. They were often poor, living a hand-to-mouth existence. You see, the cost of flour, fuel, and labor were high, and their profits were often razor-thin, especially given the draconian regulations we're about to get into. Many bakeries weren't independently wealthy enterprises. They were often subsidized by local lords or powerful guilds, who had their own tight grip on the supply chain and the prices. The baker was a cog in a much larger, often exploitative machine. They were essential, but easily replaceable, and certainly not living a life of luxury. It was a strange paradox. They produced the most important foodstuff, yet often had little to show for it themselves, living in the shadow of the very bread they created. And now, we arrive at the truly terrifying aspect of a medieval baker's life: the regulation. Specifically, the almost obsessive, paranoid fixation on fair weight. If you think modern food safety standards are strict, you haven't met medieval England. Bread wasn't just a regulated food. It was the most regulated food in medieval Europe, bar none. Why? Because it was the primary calorie source for almost everyone. Cheating on bread was seen as cheating the very lifeblood of the community, hitting the poorest the hardest. It wasn't just a minor offense, it was a fundamental betrayal. Consider the assize of bread and ale, a set of laws first established in England as far back as 1266. This wasn't some gentle suggestion. This was the law of the land. It didn't just fix the price of bread, it fixed the weight of bread and even the quality of bread, all based on the constantly fluctuating cost of grain. So, if the price of wheat went up, the size of the loaf had to go down to maintain the fixed price. If grain was cheap, the loaves had to be larger. The baker had to be a mathematician, an economist, and a prophet, constantly adjusting their output based on market forces completely out of their control, all while trying to make a living. The law required bakers to produce loaves of exact, standardized weights. We're talking ounces, sometimes even fractions of ounces. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an ironclad rule. Deviations weren't treated as minor errors. They were seen as blatant fraud against the community, against every hungry mouth in the town. Now, let's get to the truly brutal part, the consequences of an underweight loaf. Imagine being a customer in medieval times. You suspect your baker has shorted you. Maybe it feels a little light, or it just looks smaller than usual. You didn't just grumble to your neighbors. Oh no. You had the right, the civic duty even, to take that suspicious loaf straight to the local market court. This wasn't a casual affair. There were official inspectors, often a respected member of the guild or the town council, who would weigh your bread against the official, standardized weights. And if it was even a few ounces light, that baker was in deep, deep trouble. The punishment for a short-weight loaf was swift, and it was public, designed to shame and deter. For a first-time offender, the baker would be fined, often heavily, which for a poor baker could mean ruin. But worse than the fine was the public humiliation. They'd be dragged to the pillory or the stocks, locked in, and made a spectacle of. Imagine being pelted with rotten vegetables, mud, or even worse, while passers-by mocked you, knowing you tried to cheat them out of their daily bread. Your reputation, which was everything in a small medieval town, would be shredded. But here's where it gets truly grim, truly brutal. For repeat offenders, the consequences escalated dramatically. We're talking about penalties that make modern justice systems seem like a day spa. If a baker was caught short-weighing loaves again and again, they weren't just fined or shamed. Oh no, their ear would literally be nailed to their own shop door. Not a symbolic nailing, not a gentle tap. An actual, painfully real nail driven through their earlobe, pinning them to the wood. And they'd be left there for hours, a living, bleeding warning to all who passed by. Then, to compound the horror, their ear would be cut off. Yes, a piece of their body severed as a permanent, agonizing reminder of their crime. Imagine living with that scar, that missing flesh, a constant mark of your failure and your punishment. In the most severe cases, particularly if the short weighing was deemed a deliberate, large-scale deception, the baker could face even worse. They might be dragged through town on a hurdle, a sort of wooden frame. Not a pleasant ride, designed to further humiliate them before an angry populace. And then for the ultimate punishment, they would be permanently banned from the trade forever. For a medieval person whose identity and livelihood were so tied to their craft, this was a living death sentence. It meant destitution, shame, and often starvation for them and their family. The phrase "to have an ear for bread," often used in medieval texts, wasn't just a quaint saying. It was a stark, literal warning. Mess with the weight of the bread, and you'll lose an ear. It was a chilling reality, a constant sword hanging over every baker's head. So, with all this hanging over them, how did any baker survive? How did they manage to bake enough bread without constantly fearing the loss of a limb? Well, some cunning bakers, desperate to avoid the pillory and the blade, exploited a rather clever loophole. This is where the famous baker's dozen comes from. Instead of just baking 12 loaves when an order came in for a dozen, they would bake 13. That extra loaf wasn't a gift out of generosity. It was a buffer. If one of their carefully weighed loaves turned out to be slightly underweight, they could swap it out with the extra one, or simply add the 13th loaf to the order as a failsafe. That way, they could ensure the customer received at least the correct weight, and often a little more, without risking their ears or their livelihood. It was a shrewd survival tactic, born out of fear and desperation, and it gave us a phrase that endures to this day. The life of a medieval baker was, without exaggeration, a brutal intersection of physical exhaustion, economic vulnerability, and draconian law. Every single loaf they pulled from that scorching oven was a gamble, not just with their profit margin, but with their health, their reputation, and very literally, their body. They were the unsung heroes who nourished entire towns, keeping communities alive. Yet they were trapped in a relentless, unforgiving system that offered little reward and enormous risk. A single mistake, a few too many grains of flour missing, and it could cost them everything. So the next time you hold a warm loaf of bread, spare a thought for the medieval baker. His story isn't one of quaint tradition, but a stark, grim reminder of a world where justice was harsh, and your daily bread was literally worth an arm and a leg, or at least an ear. If you found this grim dive into medieval history fascinating, make sure to check out our next video popping up on your screen right now.